So what I want to do here is take the next several weeks to cover the death and return of Superman. And what I'm hoping is that at the end of all this, you'll have a strong understanding of the story going into future discussions, but also have a grasp of why people feel so strongly about it and why some say that it destroyed death in comics. So the death of Superman was actually a long time running and has its roots in as early as 1971. What I mean here is that during my series on Superman leading up to Crisis on Infinite Earths, we had talked about how the debut and introduction of his character in 1939 ushered in a new era for print media. Prior to this, stories involving fictional content largely existed in three forms: written novels, both long and short, pulp magazines, and newspaper strips. Where novels are pretty straightforward, classic stories like Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, and even earlier writings like Homer's Epic Odyssey and Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy helped to set the standard for defining the classical definition of good versus evil. Likewise, pulp magazines and newspaper strips were themselves influenced by these classical works, and many of Superman's precursor themes and characters like Doc Savage, Zorro, and the Phantom Detective were instrumental in influencing the design of Superman himself regarding the superhero archetype. As such, when he first appeared in Action Comics issue number 1 began the Golden Age and created the comic book superhero as we know it today, the varying spin-offs like Batman, Captain America, and others embody the very essence of what Superman stood for: battling the forces of villainy and saving the day. However, as the Golden Age of comics began to wane and various titles were met with cancellation, Superman remained a popular character due to the fact that he was the original comic superhero, but also had a Superboy publication under the creation of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, which kept him popular among younger boys and kept him afloat amidst the rising popularity of science fiction. And so when DC editor Julius Schwartz orchestrated the unofficial reboot of the DC Universe in 1956 by introducing Barry Allen as the Flash, he alongside Mort Weisinger began the process of expanding on their flagship character by adding something new to the Superman landscape every 6 months. To this end, between 1959 and 1971, the Superman comics expanded to include 2 solo series, one for Lois Lane and one for Jimmy Olsen, but also saw the introduction of Supergirl, the varying super animals including Krypto, Beppo the Monkey, and Comet the Horse, but also expanded on the role of Superboy in providing backstories that explain the existence of Superman's most prominent villains like Lex Luthor in terms of why he hated the Man of Steel so much. The result was that by the time 1971 rolled around, Superman was a hero with astronomical strength vulnerable only to the varying forms of kryptonite as well as magic, had a whole host of abilities ranging from one-off powers like super mathematics to mainstay powers like super hearing and X-ray vision, and stood atop DC's pantheon as the most popular hero in their lineup. And so when Mort Weisinger retired and Julius Schwartz returned to oversee Superman's comics, Schwartz operated under the belief that Superman was too powerful and kryptonite existed as a plot device. Using this as a basis, a literal swath was cut through all of Superman's publications, his powers were reduced by 1/2, kryptonite was removed entirely, and his spacefaring adventures were replaced with battles against street-level criminals. However, where Schwartz had hoped that this would humanize the hero in the eyes of potential fans, the existing reader base hated the idea, and that to them, Superman's legacy was larger than life and that his stories needed to reflect this by providing battles against larger-than-life villains. Now, at the same time that this was happening, DC had established their multiverse in 1961, using it as a means to explain the sudden disappearance of the Golden Age heroes of Jay Garrick and Alan Scott, and their replacement by Barry Allen and Hal Jordan respectively. What this meant was that the door had been blown off its hinges regarding the possibilities of alternate reality counterparts to Superman, and by 1985, with Crisis on Infinite Earths, the DC landscape had a multitude of alternate universe versions of Superman, as well as their various other characters, but they had also created a veritable witch's brew of continuity issues, with new fans having no clue where to start or where exactly he fit in regarding any particular storyline. And so following Crisis on Infinite Earths and the reconciliation of all the alternate universes, their removal from existence, with the most popular characters being folded into the main continuity referred to as New Earth, the Superman series was taken over by writer John Byrne, who spent the next 3 years effectively retelling Superman's stories and providing a new foundation for his character. The drawback to this was that because of Schwartz's actions in the 1970s, the dedicated Superman reader base had effectively abandoned this series, and where the possibility existed in terms of their return, the continuity reboot of Crisis on Infinite Earths left a bad taste in their mouths due to the fact that it signified the idea that the Superman they knew would never come back. To this end, the field was left open for another hero to step into the limelight as DC's top character, which came to fruition by way of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight, allowing Batman to overtake Superman in terms of both popularity and sales. The result was that for 5 years between 1987 and 1992, Superman continually slipped in relevance, with fans preferring the darker and grittier stories of Batman. And so faced with this fact, in the summer of 1991 during their annual summit, DC brought in the writers and artists of the Superman line in an effort to find a way to restore his character to relevance. However, the issue that DC faced was that in a lot of ways, people viewed the stories of Superman as archaic and that the world had changed, and even if it still held a place in the hearts and minds of some, most individuals didn't identify themselves as someone who always did the right thing and always made the right call. Instead, people recognized the contradictory nature of humanity and the fact that our words don't always match our actions, but because Superman's rigid stance of a hero fighting villains was virtually unshakable and the core of what made him who he was, the idea was to introduce a story that would return him to relevance without destroying his legacy. During a 2014 interview with Andrew Steinbeister of comicbook.com, Death of Superman writer Dan Jurgens had stated that the initial idea as it had been designed at the summit was to finally bring Clark Kent and Lois Lane together by having the two get married. Where John Byrne's 1987 story Superman: The Secret Revealed provided the long-awaited revelation to Lois that Clark and Superman were one and the same, since his introduction in 1939, the two had never been married before. As a result, at the conclusion of a year-long build-up, DC intended to have Superman reveal his identity to Lois, with marriage coming out of the decision. However, during this time, Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman was already in production, and as a byproduct of the deal worked out between DC's parent company Warner Brothers and ABC, DC Comics and ABC had to work jointly to ensure that neither produced content that would disrupt the flow of the other. To this end, when DC announced their intention to have Lois and Clark marry, ABC had the company hold off since it was an idea they enjoyed and could actually make more money on their end with it than DC could through their comics. And so with a year's worth of stories being thrown out the window, DC went back to the drawing board in order to find another way to make Superman relevant. During this time, as one of the long-standing members of Superman's Summit, writer Jerry Ordway had always ended his meetings with the team by making the statement, "Let's just kill him." But because the writers for the Superman stories were irritated at the time regarding their inability to write the story they had spent so long working on, rather than dismissing Jerry's comments as nonsense, instead, the idea stuck and the decision was made to write the death of Superman. Following this, the focus of the creative team was split into 4 ideas. Craft a story that provided an unshakable finality, create a villain that could actually kill Superman, provide the story of how it happened, and answer the most important question, what happens after? To the first, because Superman had been in existence for almost 60 years at the time, virtually every story that could be written had already been done. Superman had already revealed his identity to Lois Lane, he had battled Darkseid on several occasions, he'd time-traveled, and he attempted to stop his planet's destruction. As a result, because comics like 1961's issue 149 by Jerry Siegel and Kurt Swan had already killed Superman, the creative team was in a boy who cried wolf situation in that fans had already heard this story before. And so in order to ensure that it would sell, the creative team needed to write the story in a way which led people to believe that not only was Superman gone, but there existed no indication that he would ever come back. Now to the second task, for writer Dan Jurgens, the biggest problem regarding the death of Superman wasn't how the story would be written, but who it was that would kill him. Because most of his villains were largely modeled after Lex Luthor in that they challenged Superman mentally rather than physically, the only person capable of going toe-to-toe against the Man of Steel without external aid would have been Darkseid. However, Jurgens wanted to introduce a new villain that could be used to kill Clark off without having to fill lingering plot holes, and that if Darkseid had killed Superman and lived, the question would be asked as to what happens next regarding his character and potential conquest of Earth. However, if Darkseid died fighting Superman, then fans would have wanted to know how the landscape of Apocalypse would change. And so looking to bypass this problem, Jurgens created Doomsday as a character that could eliminate the possibility of lingering plot lines by killing off Superman and dying in the process. However, simply creating Doomsday and throwing him into the story couldn't be done overnight, and an event of this magnitude needed a kind of build-up in order to achieve the effect that DC was looking for. The reason why is because despite his lack of sales, Superman signified the greatness of humanity, and that as the father of the modern superhero, was literally the foundation by which all other heroes had been built on. To this end, Doomsday needed to function as the antithesis to Superman, and that he could be devoid of emotion and concern for the well-being of others, represent a fundamental force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with, and bring life to the idea the Superman had finally encountered a being whom he couldn't overcome. And so a month before the death of Superman, and within the pages of Man of Steel issue number 17, Superman number 73, Adventures of Superman number 496, and Action Comics number 683, DC had Louise Simonson, among others, continue the trend of Clark fighting his various foes, but at the end of each comic, a green cloth arm with bones protruding could be seen punching its way through a metal box, culminating in Man of Steel issue number 18 with the first on-page appearance of Doomsday. Having said that, I want to transition now to the origin of Doomsday. Covered within the three-part series titled Superman Doomsday Hunter-Prey, which was written by Jan Jurgens and drawn by Brett Breeding, this particular story comes out of the events of the death of Superman. Because the story was so popular with fans looking to see how it was Doomsday came into existence, the series follows up after Superman's return, with Doomsday haunting his dreams as the one villain that seemingly killed him. Traveling to the nexus of all reality, Superman looks to seek out individuals who are referred to as the Linear Men. Now, within the context of DC Comics, the Linear Men served as a general title for a group of men and women who served to eliminate paradoxes in the space-time continuum and ensure that the continuity flowed without interruption to its completion, which was usually presumed to be the end of all things. However, because they dealt directly with time itself, this afforded Clark the opportunity to literally view the past and discover the origin of Doomsday so that he could find a way to finally defeat him. What we're told is that in the early years of Krypton's formation and around 250,000 years before the arrival of Superman's race, the planet existed as a harsh environment with unpredictable weather and savage animals. During this time, the planet was visited by a scientist named Bertrand, and alongside his lab assistants, intended to grow an infant through vitro fertilization and subject it to the harsh environment for the purpose of forcing it to continually die and adapt. Now, during a conversation with his lab techs, Bertrand reveals that the singular basis behind his actions is for the purpose of creating a wildly powerful being who can effectively withstand any fight and can be used by Bertrand to place himself at the peak of existence by using Doomsday as a weapon against his foes. And so in his first experiment, the infant is sent to the environment of Krypton unprotected, during which time it's almost immediately spotted by the various animals and attacked. The result is that in only 2 short seconds, the infant is completely torn to shreds and presumably consumed by the animals, although this is never really confirmed. However, one of the scientists is sent out to retrieve some of the remaining tissue which can be used to clone the infant and begin the process a second time. Now, what's interesting about this is that within the realm of genetics, this isn't unheard of. While we as humans only have a limited understanding in terms of its full potential, we do know that the genes of an organism are the byproduct of its parent organisms, and that those genes effectively serve to provide the best chance of survival within the context of its ecosystem. What Dan Jurgens is doing here is applying this concept to Doomsday and telling us that the purpose of Bertrand continually subjecting the infant to the harsh environment of Krypton, watching it die, collecting its tissue, and then cloning it again, meant that the experience of how it died and how to adapt to that particular instance will continually live on within each organism, building up like a pyramid until it reached its final form. Indeed, what Dan Jurgens tells us is that when the baby was released into the environment, if it wasn't killed by the predators in the area, it would die from any number of other factors, all within a matter of moments. In one instance, the heat of the environment would literally cook it from the inside out. In another instance, the skin would adapt to the heat, but the lungs would be unable to handle the extreme pressure and would burst. And so each time the infant died and was recloned, it would become immune to each of these causes, and so that after 30 years of the cycle of death and rebirth, the infant was finally able to remain outside for only several hours. Where the infant did die during its encounter with the predators, this particular instance was a good indication of Bertrand's work in that the baby was developing both the knowledge and physical attributes necessary to ensure its survival, meaning that after an unspecified amount of time, the infant had managed to survive on the planet for 2 years, growing into a fully functional adult form. However, the failure of Bertrand comes into full view when we realize that because the process had taken so long, he gave no thought to what would happen when Doomsday was advanced enough to survive and eliminate all the organisms on the planet. Furthermore, because the experiments of Bertrand saw all the previous forms of Doomsday dying leading up to his current form, Doomsday came to the belief that Bertrand himself, along with all of his ilk, were an enemy that needed to be eliminated to ensure its own survival. And so breaking his way into the facility, Doomsday killed Bertrand and all of the scientists within their own base of operations, owing to the fact that because he had been designed to withstand and adapt to any circumstance, he had quite literally become Frankenstein's monster and that Bertrand could not control or stop him. And so following this, because Bertrand operated in isolation and away from other beings with the exception of his staff, A series of supply drops were commissioned to ensure that Bertrand had the supplies he needed without being bothered during his experiments. However, the condition of these supply drops was that no contact would be made, and instead, they would simply show up, drop off what was needed, and leave. As a result, when the supply ship arrived, Doomsday hitched a ride, allowing him to escape the planet. Now from here, Jurgens doesn't really give us a play-by-play of Doomsday's exploits, and in truth, we don't really need it. Given that this story took place after the death of Superman, the formidability of Doomsday spoke for itself, and so instead, Jurgens simply tells us that Doomsday would arrive on a planet, kill everything over the course of several years, escape, and continue the pattern across the universe. Now to be clear, Doomsday is not in and of himself a highly intelligent being. Instead, he's largely governed by his instincts, which drive him to kill all life, and where he's not smart enough to physically pilot a vessel, he is smart enough to stow away on one. Where Jurgens doesn't tell us exactly how he traveled from world to world, I would surmise that whenever he attacked a world, its occupants would put up a fight, realize they were outmatched, and flee, during which time Doomsday would stow away on a vessel, kill its inhabitants, and start the process again when he arrived on the new world as it was programmed by the ship's navigation. But regardless of the intricacies of how he moved throughout the cosmos, the fact remains that his actions drew the attention of a race called the Calatonians. As a group that had predated the Kryptonians and were the most technologically advanced race at the time, within 3 years after his arrival, Doomsday had laid waste to all but the capital of their society. And so because the royal family had begun the early stages of metahuman development, the decision was made to bring the royal family together who would sacrifice their powers, losing their lives in the process, for the sake of creating an artificial life form known as the Radiant, which could battle Doomsday. In a fight that took over a week from start to finish, the essence of Doomsday's ability to recover from death came to fruition when the Radiant had bombarded him with energy attacks, something Doomsday had never experienced before. Because the remaining members of the Catalonian society maintained their burial rituals not unlike humanity, the decision was made to lock Doomsday away in a block of metal and send him careening into space, destined to drift for eternity. However, during the process, Doomsday's vessel came into contact with an asteroid field, during which time he was thrown off course, where it landed on Earth and remained buried underground for over 200,000 years. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and next week, we'll begin the process of actually getting into the death of Superman proper. With that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.